Katie Morrison's locker smelled like gun oil and regret. She stood in the break room at Mercy General in Houston, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped wasps, and wrapped the combat boots in plastic one more time. 8 months into this life, 8 months of being nobody, and the boots still held the red dust of Tikrit in the seams. She'd tried washing them once. The dust came back. Some things don't leave you, no matter how hard you scrub. The boots went to the bottom of her locker, beneath the spare scrubs and the protein bar she never ate. She closed the door without looking at her reflection in the scratched metal surface. Reflections were dangerous. Reflections asked questions she couldn't answer. 6:27 a.m. 13 minutes until shift change. The break room was empty except for the smell of burnt coffee and antiseptic, that particular hospital smell that lived under your fingernails after 12 hours and didn't wash out for 3 days. Katie poured black coffee into a ceramic mug with a chip on the rim, the kind nobody else would take. She had learned the rhythms of Mercy General the way she had learned the rhythms of a city under siege: observe, adapt, disappear into the noise. Don't stand out. Don't let anyone look too close. Her left leg ached as she Saturday. The shrapnel was still in there, fragments of something that wasn't supposed to exist lodged against bone. The doctors at Walter Reed had said it was inoperable. Too close to the femoral artery. Too risky. So she lived with it, a quiet hum of pain that started around 4 a.m. and didn't stop until she slept. She'd been living with worse for 20 years. The coffee was terrible. She drank it anyway. Morning, Katie. She looked up. Jennifer Chen, one of the day shift nurses, stood in the doorway with her own chipped mug. Mid-30s, kind eyes, the type of nurse who actually remembered patient names after they were discharged. They'd worked 3 shifts together. Jennifer had tried to be friendly each time. Katie had learned how to be polite without being known. Morning, Katie said. Jennifer nodded, smiled a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and turned toward the coffee maker. The silence that followed was the sound of a door closing. Katie had gotten used to that sound. She recognized it in other people, the moment they decided you weren't worth the effort. It was fine. It was safer that way. The shift handoff began at 7:15 a.m. in the hallway outside the ICU, where the fluorescent lights were even harsher and the smell of wound dressing and saline hung thick enough to taste. Katie stood at the edge of the group, clipboard in hand, and listened to the night shift nurse, Marcus, tall guy with exhausted eyes, report on the current census. 7 patients. 3 post-op. 2 trauma transfers from the ER. 1 elderly gentleman admitted overnight with chest pain, still waiting for stress test results. Mr. Chen in Bay 3, Marcus said, running through the vitals. Vitals stable as of 6 a.m. BP 138/82. Heart rate 71. O2 sat 98% on room air. Wife was here until midnight. Real nervous type. You'll want to keep an eye on her. Katie nodded. Wrote nothing down. She had learned to trust the information that lived in her head rather than on paper. Habits from before. When taking notes could get people killed. Morrison, you've got him first thing, the charge nurse said. Diana, 40-something, the kind of woman who'd been running hospital units before Katie was even born. Vitals Q2H, watch for any EKG changes. Cardiology might want him downstairs for the stress test depending on the troponin levels. Got it, Katie said. 6 words. That was her voice in this life. Short. Efficient. Forgettable. The group dispersed like hospital staff always did, a controlled chaos of people moving in different directions, voices already shifting from night to day, from exhaustion to renewed purpose. Katie was pulling on her scrubs when she saw him. Dr. Sterling. He stood at the far end of the hallway, coffee in hand, watching the shift change with the kind of focused intensity that made her breath catch for exactly half a second before she controlled it. Everything about him was expensive, the shoes, Italian leather, she could tell from 30 feet away, the watch that probably cost more than her monthly rent, the way his coat hung like he'd been tailored for it personally. But it was his eyes that made her careful. Those eyes had the flat, assessing quality of someone used to finding weakness in other people and using it. He was watching her. Katie kept her head down, finished buttoning her scrub top, and looked away. The golden rule: don't be interesting. Don't be memorable. Don't be anything that made people want to ask questions about where you came from or what you'd done or why your hands moved like they'd been trained in field trauma units instead of civilian hospitals. She turned toward the ICU. That was when she saw him move. The clicking of his Italian shoes on linoleum was the only sound for a moment. The rest of the hallway had somehow gone quiet, or maybe that was just her attention narrowing the way it used to narrow when incoming fire was close. He walked toward her with the kind of casual confidence that came from never being questioned. He was taller than he'd looked from across the hallway. That presence, the kind that made people stand differently around him, like they were all trying to take up less space. Morrison. Not a question. A statement. I'm Dr. Sterling. I'll be watching you closely. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to show respect, short enough to avoid challenging him, and nodded once. Understood, Doctor. Good. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. I have very high standards on this unit. I'm sure you'll want to meet them. Yes, sir. For words this time. Even shorter. Even quieter. The voice of someone with nothing to prove because she had nothing to give him. She could feel him analyzing her, the slight favoring of her left leg, the way her hand stayed relaxed at her sides, the absence of any jewelry or identification beyond her hospital badge. He was still smiling when he walked past her toward the charge nurse's station. Katie exhaled, very slowly, and continued toward the ICU. Her heart rate was elevated. That was fine. That would pass. Her hands were steady. That was better. Her hands had been steady through worse than a territorial doctor with expensive shoes and the kind of arrogance that came from having never been truly afraid. The ICU smelled like ventilators and the particular silence that came with serious illness. 6 beds, separated by glass partitions and monitors that beeped in different rhythms, a sick symphony of pulse oximetry and EKG traces and ventilator cycles. Bay 3 was on the far side, and in it, an elderly man lay propped at a 45-degree angle, watching the ceiling with the kind of focused awareness that came from not knowing if your heart was about to betray you. Mrs. Chen was asleep in the chair next to his bed, her purse clutched against her chest, her face lined with the particular exhaustion that came from hospital vigils at midnight. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," Katie said softly, coming around the bed. "I'm Katie. I'm going to check your vitals this morning." He turned his head. Brown eyes, intelligent eyes, the kind that had probably seen a lot before this. "You look like you could use some sleep yourself," he said. Katie smiled. A real one. Just a small curve of her mouth, but real. "Coffee's not hitting yet. Let me get your blood pressure." She worked through the sequence with the kind of precision that lived in her hands, muscle memory from a different life, before the classified folder and the scrubbed records and the name that didn't exist anymore. The blood pressure cuff inflated with its familiar pneumatic sigh. 141/84. Slightly elevated. Probably anxiety. The kind of anxiety that came from thinking about your own mortality at 3 a.m. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, temperature. All normal. All stable. The body of a man having a medical event but not a catastrophic one. Not yet, anyway. "Everything looks good this morning," Katie said, unwrapping the cuff. "The doctors will want to do that stress test once cardiology looks at your EKG. Might be today, might be tomorrow. Either way, you're in good hands." "What's your name again?" Mr. Chen asked. "Katie." "Katie," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "You ever feel like something's not right inside yourself, but you can't quite explain what?" She paused. Looked at him directly. "Yes," she said. "I felt that." "That's what this is," he said. Like my chest knows something my brain hasn't caught up to yet. Does that make sense? It makes sense, Katie said. That's why you came here. We're going to figure out what it is. And then we're going to fix it. She said it the way she used to say things, not like a trauma nurse offering comfort, but like a senior chief petty officer giving an objective assessment of a tactical situation. Certain. Authoritative. The kind of certainty that came from having been wrong before and learned how to read the difference between panic and intuition. Mr. Chen nodded. Seemed to relax slightly. I believe you, he said. Katie finished her charting at the nurse's station, 3 beds away from where Dr. Sterling was reviewing a patient's EKG with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he'd found something interesting. She kept her head down, kept her hands moving through the routine, vitals entered, notes recorded, the machinery of hospital care grinding along in its particular rhythm. It wasn't until she was halfway through charting Mr. Chen's vitals that she realized Sterling was watching her again. Not casually. Not the way a supervisor checked on his staff. The way a predator watched something that might be interesting to hunt. She wrote the last vital sign without changing her expression, closed the chart, and turned toward the medication dispensary. Her leg ached. Her hands were steady. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running scenarios, assessing exits, doing all the calculus of staying invisible that had become so automatic she barely noticed it anymore. But that wasn't the worst part of having Dr. Sterling watching her with that particular kind of focus. The worst part was that somewhere beneath the careful construction of Katie Morrison, quiet, forgettable, professional, something else was waking up. Something that had been asleep for 20 years. Something that recognized a threat and wanted to respond to it. Something that remembered how to fight. The morning rounds with Mr. Chen's daughter started like every other day, sterile, controlled, Dr. Sterling moving through the ICU like a man inspecting property he owned. Katie was adjusting the full line on the elderly veteran's arm when Sterling entered with his tablet and that particular smile, the one that looked like a predator testing the fence. Mr. Chen's daughter, Susan, stood at her father's bedside, anxiety etched into every line of her face. Katie had been monitoring his medication timing carefully, warfarin interactions with the new cardiac glycoside required precision. She'd noted it in the chart. Flagged it clearly. Because that's what a competent trauma nurse does. Sterling glanced at her notes and his jaw shifted imperceptibly. Ms. Morrison here seems to think she can diagnose cardiac conditions, he said, loud enough for the daughter to hear. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. Nurses don't make diagnostic calls, do they? Susan's eyes flicked between Katie and Sterling, confusion morphing into suspicion. Katie took one measured breath. Her hands remained steady on the blood pressure cuff, 96/64, down 2 points since yesterday. Not alarming, but trending. She said nothing. Silence was a weapon she'd learned long ago, one that required more discipline than words. Sterling turned to Susan with that practiced warmth, the bedside manner he reserved for families and hospital administrators. Perhaps our little medic here forgot her place. But I assure you, your father's cardiac care is in qualified hands. The word medic hung in the air like a slur. Susan looked at Katie, really looked at her, and saw what Sterling wanted her to see, a young nurse overstepping, a threat to her father's care. By the time the rounds ended, Susan had requested a different nurse for the evening shift. Sterling noted it in his own tablet with the expression of a chess player moving a piece into checkmate. Katie didn't react. Her hands didn't tremble. But something in her chest tightened, the kind of tension that came from remembering how small people like to make you feel when they sense weakness. 3 days passed. 3 days of Sterling methodically building his case, each insult calibrated, each slight strategically placed. He was competent, that was the truly dangerous thing about him. He wasn't a screamer or a bully who lost control. He was calculated, measured, a man who understood that destroying someone slowly was far more effective than dramatic displays. On Friday morning, Katie arrived for the shift change to find a formal notice posted on the unit board where all staff could see it, laminated and centered, Nurse Morrison, written warning for overstepping scope of practice. Her name in bold. Her violation in plain text. Sterling read it aloud during shift change in front of 12 staff members, his voice dripping with faux concern. Some people think 8 months of experience makes them an expert. It doesn't. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like judgment. Katie stood at the back of the group, her body still, her breathing controlled. One tear escaped down her left cheek, not from sadness, but from the burning pressure of restraint, the physical manifestation of a warrior forced to stand motionless while being measured for her coffin. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Sterling. "You're afraid of what I see, not what I've done," she said. Her voice was flat. Controlled. Not a question or a plea, a statement of fact delivered by someone who'd already survived worse. The room went dead silent. Sterling's jaw tightened. For a moment, something flickered across his face, not anger, but recognition, the brief terrible awareness that he'd struck at something harder than he'd calculated. He turned away first. That mattered. In a contest of wills, the first person to break eye contact loses. Sterling had lost. But that wasn't the worst part. What she didn't know was that he was only beginning. The break room at Mercy General was a shrine to institutional indifference, fluorescent lights, a refrigerator that hummed like a dying animal, a microwave that smelled of 1,000 reheated lunches. Katie entered on her lunch break carrying a sandwich and the weight of accumulated isolation. For nurses sat at the primary table, Amy, Jessica, Marcus, and one of the newer floats whose name Katie could never quite remember. They were laughing about weekend plans, their voices carrying the easy comfort of people who belong to something. The moment Katie sat down at the far end of the table, the conversation stopped as if someone had cut the audio. One by one, they gathered their food, trays, napkins, half-empty yogurts. One by one, they moved to a corner table without a word, without even the courtesy of eye contact. The sound of their chairs scraping against the tile floor echoed in the silence. Katie opened her sandwich. Turkey and avocado on wheat. She took one bite and heard them whispering from their new position, their voices low but not low enough. She didn't look up. She finished eating in complete silence, the fluorescent lights pressing down like a physical weight, and when she was done, she wiped her mouth with a paper napkin, threw away her trash, and returned to the floor. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply moved from one place to another, a professional nurse completing her break, and if anyone had been watching closely enough to see the moment when something inside her crystallized into something harder and colder, they would have recognized it as the moment a patient's hand stops trembling because they've accepted that they will not survive. What happened next came at 0300 hours, 3 in the morning, when the hospital held its breath and the ER filled with the kind of human wreckage that didn't come with insurance and didn't come with answers. A level 1 trauma, male, mid-20s, unconscious, found collapsed outside a military recruiting station on Bellaria Boulevard. No wallet. No phone. No identification. Just a body and questions no one could answer. Katie was assigned to intake. As they cut away his shirt in the trauma bay, she saw it on his right shoulder, a 75th Regiment tattoo, the distinctive scroll and insignia that meant Army Ranger, that meant years of impossible training, that meant this man had stood on mountains and in deserts and places with names that only showed up on classified maps. Her breath caught. Her hands froze for exactly 1 second on the 4 kit she was preparing. She knew that ink. She knew exactly what it meant because she'd seen it before, worn versions of it, men and women who carried that mark like a covenant. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, was barking orders about fluids and portable X-rays, and Katie mentioned it quietly, professionally, as if it were just another clinical observation. 75th Regiment. Suggests military service. Recommend contacting Arlington database. Chen nodded, made a note. The information moved through the system like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach the shore, but not yet. By morning, a woman in her 50s arrived at the trauma unit, frantic, having seen the recruiting station incident on local news and recognized the description. Her son, Marcus Webb, an Army Ranger who'd been acting strange lately, refusing to talk about his recent deployment, disappearing for hours, coming back with that look in his eyes that mothers learn to recognize as something breaking. She was escorted to the ICU where the unconscious man lay, machines breathing for him, monitors tracking the diminishing electrical storms of his heart. She confirmed the identification through shaking tears. But she had no idea why her son had no identification, no wallet, nothing but his body and the history written on his skin. Katie stood outside the room as Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds, still operating his campaign against her with the precision of a man playing chess with someone's entire life. Mrs. Webb was in the hallway, crying, asking anyone who would listen what was wrong with her boy, why he wouldn't wake up, what had happened to him. Sterling reviewed the chart. His eyes narrowed when he saw Katie's note about the tattoo and the military contact suggestion. He saw her clinical observation, and what he saw was not competence, it was threat. It was a reminder that she was noticing things, remembering things, moving through the world with a knowledge that went deeper than 8 months at Mercy General. His expression shifted slightly, something calculating moving behind his eyes. He turned to Mrs. Webb with that practiced warmth, introducing himself as the attending physician overseeing her son's care, and as he spoke, Katie understood that the game had escalated. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. This was about containment. This was about a man who'd sensed something dangerous in the quiet nurse and decided that building a file on her incompetence was no longer enough. The Level 1 alert came through at 0300 hours, and Katie was already moving before the overhead finished announcing it. Mercy General's Trauma Bay had a specific rhythm at this hour, the controlled urgency of a team that had done this 1,000 times, stripped of the day shift's unnecessary conversation. The ambulance ramp doors burst open, and the paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a male in his mid-20s, unconscious, vitals unstable. No wallet. No ID. No phone. Just a man the paramedics had found collapsed outside a recruiting station on Richmond Avenue, as if his body had simply decided to stop. Katie caught the stretcher's rail and moved with it into the trauma bay, her eyes already cataloguing what the paramedics were saying: altered mental status, found unresponsive, no witnesses, no obvious trauma, but something was wrong with his breathing pattern, something shallow and off. The senior resident was barking orders. The respiratory tech was prepping equipment. Katie's hands moved on their own, muscle memory from her first 8 months at Mercy General taking over as she threaded an 4-line into the patient's left arm, 18-gauge angiocath, smooth as practiced prayer. 2 liters normal saline, wide open. Labs to blood bank. Get imaging ready. She was focused entirely on the work, on the technical precision that was the only language Sterling had never been able to weaponize against her, when she noticed it. The patient's left shoulder was exposed where the paramedics had cut his shirt away for initial assessment. A tattoo, faded but unmistakable. 3 triangles arranged in a specific configuration, beneath them the numeral 75 rendered in a style she'd seen exactly once before, 20 years ago, in a forward operating base just outside Tikrit where she'd coordinated casualty evacuation for a unit that no longer existed in any official record. The 75th Regiment. Not just any Army Ranger unit. That specific unit. Katie's hand stilled for exactly 2 seconds. Her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat, held there like a physical thing. The room continued its controlled chaos around her, the beeping monitors, the murmur of voices, but inside her chest, something had shifted. She knew that tattoo. She'd authorized soldiers to get variations of it as a morale thing, a unit marker, a way to carry home something that looked like nothing at all. And this man, this unconscious stranger, he was carrying one of those marks. The footsteps came before the words did. Measured, authoritative, the sound of someone accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around his presence. Dr. Sterling entered the trauma bay and glanced at the patient for perhaps 2 seconds before his eyes moved to Katie, and in that glance was something she'd learned to recognize, the calculation of a man building a case, a man noting that she was here, that her hands had just been on this patient, that she had noticed something in the half-second her hands had stilled. He didn't ask. He simply said, "Step back, Katie," and the subtext was crystalline, "I see you noticing things. I see you recognizing things you shouldn't recognize. I'm taking this now." Katie moved to the periphery of the trauma bay, her hands falling to her sides in the prescribed posture of subordination. Sterling took position where she'd been standing, already ordering a chest X-ray, already asking the paramedics about vitals trends, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had never questioned his right to be the smartest person in any room. He was competent, Katie had to grant him that. His assessment was methodical. His orders were crisp. But he was looking at a man in a 75th Regiment tattoo and seeing only another unconscious admission, another chart to control, another set of variables he could manipulate into evidence of Katie's incompetence if things went wrong. What he didn't see was what Katie saw. What he couldn't see. The patient's chest was rising and falling in a pattern that suggested something catastrophic was building beneath the surface, something that no chest X-ray would have time to catch. The skin tone was too pale. The capillary refill in his fingernail beds was too slow. The way his neck was angling suggested tracheal deviation, and if the trachea was deviating, that meant pressure was building in the pleural space, air accumulating where air didn't belong, pushing the heart and the great vessels aside, and with every breath the patient took, the pressure was increasing, and the time window to intervene was measured not in hours but in minutes. She could say something. She could step forward and violate the implicit hierarchy that Sterling had just reinforced by ordering her to step back. She could invoke the clinical judgment she'd been trained to use across 2 decades of carrying people through trauma, trained to use in environments where the cost of silence was measured in body bags. But Sterling had already made it clear that any clinical input from Katie was overstepping. Any suggestion would be interpreted as insubordination. Any pushback would accelerate the termination process that she could feel he was already constructing. So Katie stepped back further and watched as Sterling ordered imaging and waited for results that wouldn't come in time. The next 2 hours moved in a strange, fractured way. Sterling reassigned her to pediatrics on the grounds that she was clearly too emotionally invested in this particular patient, too inclined to let tattoos influence her clinical judgment, too much of a liability on a critical case. He delivered the reassignment in front of the charge nurse and the attending physician, each word a brick in the wall he was building. Katie accepted the reassignment without argument, accepted it the way she'd accepted every humiliation and every slight since arriving at Mercy General, because arguing would have been worse. Because staying employed was the only way to stay invisible. But the sound of that tattoo, the visual weight of it, stayed with her as she moved through the pediatric unit, as she assessed fevers and changed 4 medications for children who had the luxury of uncomplicated childhoods, who would never understand what it meant to carry a mark that changed you from a person into a unit, a classification, a ghost. Then the text came through at 1,147 hours. Her former colleague, a respiratory therapist named Marcus who'd actually stood beside her when Sterling had posted the disciplinary notice, sent 3 words, web crashing. Sterling's handling. Katie didn't think. She didn't weigh the consequences or calculate whether this was a test or a trap or simply the universe finally showing her that staying silent meant someone died. She simply moved. Abandoned her station in pediatrics, a violation that would definitely go in Sterling's file, and ran for the ICU, her scrubs making that specific sound against the hallway tiles, rubber-soled shoes striking in an urgent rhythm that turned heads. The ICU nurse station was controlled chaos, monitors beeping their various alarms, and Katie could already hear it before she saw it, the ventilators changed tone, the way it sounded like a machine working against resistance, like air fighting for passage through territory it couldn't reach. She found his room and stopped in the doorway because the scene before her was no longer ambiguous. Marcus Webb's trachea was visibly deviated to the left. His breathing was agonal, the desperate, involuntary gasps of a body that was running out of oxygen, out of time, out of any remaining options. His oxygen saturation on the monitor was plummeting, 88, 84, 79, 75. Sterling was ordering a stat chest X-ray as if imaging would somehow slow the pressure that was building in the patient's chest, as if a picture of the problem would substitute for treating it. Katie's mother, Mrs. Webb, was standing at the foot of the bed with both hands pressed against her mouth, her body moving in that particular way of people watching their child slip away, the helpless rotation of someone without the medical knowledge to save what they loved most. Dr. Sterling saw Katie in the doorway and his voice came out like a weapon, "Get out of this unit now, or you're fired." "That is not a request." Katie looked at Mrs. Webb's face. She looked at the monitor reading 71% oxygen saturation. She looked at the visible deviation of the trachea and understood in that moment what the next 5 minutes would hold: a patient coding, a family destroyed, a chart that would document the failure in perfect clinical language, and Dr. Sterling's voice explaining afterward that sometimes patients simply decompensate despite best efforts, despite everything. A tragedy. Very unfortunate. Nothing anyone could have prevented. She thought about the pair of worn combat boots in her locker, the ones she'd carried since Tikrit, the ones that had been on her feet when she'd made decisions that saved 47 lives, when she'd moved under fire to extract a wounded interpreter's son from a kill zone because the alternative was unthinkable. She thought about the oath she'd taken, the one that had never actually been revoked, just erased from every official record as if she'd never sworn it at all. The oxygen saturation hit 68. Katie stepped forward into the trauma bay, and when she moved, it was with an authority that was neither requested nor granted. The oxygen saturation hit 68. Katie stepped forward into the trauma bay, and when she moved, it was with an authority that was neither requested nor granted. Marcus Webb's breathing had shifted into the irregular, gasping pattern of a man drowning in his own physiology. His trachea had drifted visibly to the right, pressed there by air accumulating in the space between his lung and chest wall. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis was written across his body in clinical shorthand that Sterling was still scanning the monitors to decipher. Sterling's eyes moved from screen to screen, his jaw tightening. His hands gripped the edge of the computer terminal, knuckles whitening. He was waiting for imaging. He was waiting for confirmation. He was waiting for anything that would justify his authority. Around him, the ICU hummed with the machinery of critical care, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, monitors beeped in fractured syncopation, the 4-pump ticked like a clock counting down. Katie didn't wait. She moved toward the crash cart with the fluid certainty of someone who had performed this procedure in conditions far worse than an air-conditioned hospital. Her hands found the 14-gauge needle and catheter without looking. The equipment was muscle memory-made steel, a language her body still spoke perfectly after 20 years of pretending to forget. She crossed to the bed in 3 strides. Sterling's voice came behind her, sharp and commanding. "Morrison, step back. Now." She didn't acknowledge him. Her fingers found the landmarks on Marcus Webb's left chest, counting the ribs with the precision of a surveyor marking a map. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her hands positioned the needle at a perpendicular angle, and she could feel the anatomical architecture beneath her fingers the way a musician feels a string before the bow touches it. This was the space between seconds, between the man breathing and the man dying. The needle went in. There was a sound, distinct and unmistakable in the sudden quiet of the room. The hiss of air escaping. A single, perfect exhalation of pressure that had been building for the last 40 minutes, compressed between Marcus Webb's lung and his chest wall, suffocating him from the inside with each breath he tried to take. The ventilator's rhythm changed. The oxygen saturation began to climb. 70. 72. 75. Dr. Chen, the attending physician who had just stepped into the ICU, went pale. His hand came to his mouth. He had seen that maneuver performed exactly once in his career, in a field medicine training seminar taught by a retired Navy surgeon at Johns Hopkins. The movement was too precise. The angle was too confident. The result was too immediate. He knew what he was watching. He knew what it meant. "You just assaulted a patient," Sterling said. His voice had dropped to something quiet and controlled, which was somehow worse than shouting. Worse because it meant he was thinking now, recalculating. "Security. I want security in here now." "She saved his life," Chen said. His own voice carried the weight of a man who understood he was about to choose a side. That was a textbook needle decompression. That was field medicine. Katie stepped back from the bed. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Marcus Webb's oxygen saturation continued its climb. 78. 81. His trachea had drifted back toward midline. The terrible, gasping urgency had left his breathing. He was still sedated, still intubated, still fighting for his life on a dozen different fronts, but in this moment, in this particular way, he was no longer dying. Sterling's mouth opened. Then closed. Then opened again, but no words came. That was the real cost of what had just happened, not medical, not professional, but personal. He had been proven uncertain. He had been shown, in front of witnesses, to be the slower thinker in a room where speed meant the difference between living and dying. A nurse had done what he couldn't. A nurse had stepped outside the boundaries he had worked so carefully to establish, and she had been right. His face darkened to a shade of crimson that looked dangerous. Not desperate yet. Not cornered yet. Just angry. Competently, strategically angry. Her credentialing will be investigated, he said to Chen, but his eyes were on Katie. Pull her file. I want the State Nursing Board notified. I want an external audit of her credentials within the hour. She could be a fraud. She could have falsified her entire application. We have no way to know. He turned and walked out of the ICU, and Katie watched him go with the calm of someone who had just made a choice she couldn't unchoose. The room exhaled. Chen was already making notes on Marcus Webb's chart, documenting the procedure, the clinical indication, the result. Behind them, a nurse was already adjusting the ventilator settings, already preparing the room for what came next. Katie turned and walked to the supply sink to wash her hands. The water ran hot, and she let it run while she scrubbed her hands and forearms in the pattern she had learned 2 decades ago, the same pattern used in operating theaters and field stations and tents lit by chemical lights in the desert. The soap smelled like hospital bleach and something clinical underneath. Antiseptic. Clean. No blood on her hands. There hadn't been for a very long time. But that wasn't the worst part. She had used classified training in front of 3 witnesses. She had performed a procedure with the signature of someone trained in military field medicine. She had moved with an authority that belonged to a rank she wasn't supposed to have anymore, and she had done it in a moment of crisis when there was no time to think about consequences. Sterling had seen it. Chen had seen it. Somewhere in the machinery of the hospital, the security cameras had probably seen it too. Her hand stopped moving under the water. Sterling's phone call came at 4:33 p.m., while Katie was reassigned to the pediatric floor as punishment, her access to the ICU revoked before she even left the building. The hospital board chairman, a man named Caldwell who played golf with Sterling on weekends, received the call at home. Sterling's voice was controlled and precise on the other end of the line. We have a serious credentialing issue. I need an investigation before she harms another patient. By 5:15 p.m., Sterling had contacted 3 of Katie's fabricated references, phone numbers he had extracted from her employment file. They didn't answer because they didn't exist, because they were the only way Katie Morrison could have a documented work history while remaining officially dead. By 5:32 p.m., he had called the State Nursing Board's External Affairs Office and demanded an immediate audit of her credentials and application materials. I don't want to allege fraud prematurely, he said carefully, but I have concerns about the authenticity of her background. By 6:04 p.m., an investigator from the Texas Board of Nursing had been assigned to the case and was already requesting Katie's complete file. By 6:11 p.m., 2 security officers were escorting Katie Morrison from the building while she was still wearing scrubs. Her identification badge was confiscated. Her locker was sealed with yellow tape. The security officers didn't speak to her, and she didn't speak to them. She simply set her credentials on the security desk, turned, and walked out through the automatic doors into the Houston heat. She walked to her car. She drove to the VA hospital across town. She sat in the waiting room among veterans with missing limbs and trauma in their eyes, the kind of damage that didn't show on intake forms but showed everywhere else, in how they sat, how they held themselves, how they looked at doorways like exits might be a problem. She filled out paperwork with a false name. Michelle Harper. She claimed shrapnel wounds in her left leg from a vehicle accident. She waited 3 hours. She was called back, examined by a doctor who asked no questions about when or where the wounds occurred, and then she sat back down in the waiting room and waited for them to move on to the next veteran. Nobody was looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison anymore. There was no longer any record of her existence in the official world. For the second time in 20 years, she had been unmade. But this time, she had done it to herself. She drove to the storage unit on the south side of Houston, the one she had paid for without accessing since arriving at Mercy General 8 months ago. The manager didn't look up when she entered. She unlocked the door and stepped inside the small, climate-controlled rectangle that contained her only remaining connection to who she actually was. The folder sat on the metal shelf, still sealed with the kind of tape that doesn't break cleanly. Classified stamped across it in red. But she didn't reach for the folder. She reached instead for the combat boots, desert tan, size 7, with faded bloodstains on the left toe from an ambush in Tikrit that had happened 20 years and 3 days ago. She picked them up, feeling the weight of them in her hands like a question she had spent 2 decades not answering. She held those boots to her chest and breathed, and for the first time since she had stepped back from Marcus Webb's bedside, her hands trembled. But not from fear. Not from failure. From the terrible knowledge that everything she had buried was about to be dug up whether she was ready or not. Security escorted her from the building at 4:47 in the afternoon. 2 officers in navy blazers, hands neutral at their sides, neither apologetic nor aggressive. Just procedural. Katie gathered her locker belongings in silence, a spare pair of scrubs, the energy drink she never finished, a photograph of a coastline she hadn't visited in 20 years. Dr. Sterling stood in the administrator's office 3 floors above, dictating his narrative into a recording device: reckless judgment, scope of practice violations, diagnostic overreach, patient endangerment. The words landed like stones into still water. Nobody who heard them would know that every action she'd taken had saved a man's life. They would only know what Sterling needed them to know. The rain started as she walked to her truck. Not gentle rain. Texas rain that hammered the asphalt like accusations, soaking through her scrub top in 30 seconds flat. She sat in the driver's seat for 11 minutes without starting the engine, her hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the position of absolute control. Her jaw was clenched so tight her temples throbbed. But she did not cry. She did not scream. She did not do anything except breathe in through her nose for a count of 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The same breathing she'd learned in a bunker outside Fallujah 20 years ago, when the world was loud and small and collapsing. By 6:30 that evening, she was sitting in a waiting room at the VA hospital on Richmond Avenue, paperwork spread across a plastic chair beside her. Shrapnel removal claim. Post-traumatic stress evaluation. Service history documentation. The irony was so profound it almost made her laugh. She'd spent 8 months erasing herself at Mercy General, becoming nobody, becoming just a nurse. Now she was trying to prove she'd been somebody, that she'd served, that the fragments of metal still lodged near her spine were souvenirs of a life the government had ordered her to forget. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and industrial cleaning fluid. A television mounted in the corner played the news with the sound off. Captions scrolled across a story about healthcare fraud investigations spreading across the state. 3 other veterans sat reading magazines, not making eye contact with each other. That was the code of the waiting room: mutual invisibility, shared pain that required no acknowledgement. One man had a prosthetic foot and wore it like a medal. Another had scars that mapped the entire left side of his face, white and raised and precise as surgical work. A woman, younger than Katie, kept rubbing her wrists as if they still remembered the ropes. Katie recognized them all. Not by face, but by the invisible weight they carried. She'd carried the same weight for 2 decades, and nobody had ever seen it. The nurse called her name. Not her rank. Not Senior Chief Morrison. Just Katie. Just another name on a clipboard. She stood and walked to the back, where a young corpsman took her blood pressure and asked routine questions in the kind voice of someone trained to ask wounded people how they were doing when everyone already knew the answer. Fine. They were all always fine. It was the only acceptable response. 3 days later, Marcus Webb regained consciousness. The attending physician, Dr. Reeves, one of the few physicians at Mercy General who had never treated Katie with contempt, was reviewing Webb's chart when the ranger's eyes opened. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm. The pulse oximeter beeped its steady confirmation. Webb's hand moved. His fingers curled. His eyes tracked the ceiling, then focused, then locked onto the worn pair of combat boots sitting on the bedside table. Someone had placed them there with intention. Not casually. Not as decoration. Those boots meant something to him, and the moment he saw them, his entire body tensed. He looked at Dr. Reeves and asked a single question: where did those come from? Dr. Reeves's hands began to shake. Not from fear. From understanding. He'd been there when Katie performed the needle decompression. He'd seen the precision. He'd heard the silence afterward. He excused himself from the room and called the hospital administrator's office. Then he called security. Then he called someone he shouldn't have called, a number buried in his Rolodex under a contact name that was clearly not a contact name at all. In the administrator's office on the 4th floor, Dr. Sterling sat at a mahogany desk with his termination letter already drafted. Katie Morrison, RN, effective immediately, for gross misconduct and violation of scope of practice standards. His pen hovered over the signature line. He'd made 17 phone calls that morning, to hospital board members, to insurance companies, to his network of allies in medical administration across the state. He was building a case so airtight that nobody would ever question why a decorated physician had felt compelled to remove an erratic nurse from the trauma unit. The narrative was tight. The documentation was solid. The only loose end was the patient himself, but an unconscious patient couldn't testify to anything. That was when the rotor wash started. The windows of Mercy General's administrative wing rattled. Not the trembling of a storm. The distinctive percussion of helicopter blades cutting air in precise rhythm. Dr. Sterling stood and walked to the window. 2 Black Hawks were descending toward the parking lot, not civilian helicopters, not emergency medical transport. Military. The kind of arrival that meant something had shifted in the universe and nobody at Mercy General had seen it coming. The hum of the rotors deepened as the aircraft settled. Bodies emerged in tactical formations. 8 operators in 75th Ranger Regiment patches moving with the fluid precision of people trained to breach buildings and survive fire zones. A SEAL team leader in front, carrying a file folder that looked older than the hospital itself. 2 FBI agents flanking him. And behind them, a 2-star general in dress uniform, medals arranged in rows that told stories Sterling would never be cleared to hear. They did not check in at reception. They did not wait for authorization. The ICU doors opened before anyone could ask them to announce themselves, and the team leader approached the bed where Marcus Webb was now fully conscious, eyes still fixed on those combat boots. The SEAL commander looked at the Ranger and nodded. Just a nod. Absolute recognition between 2 people who'd shared a language that most of the world didn't speak. Senior Chief Morrison, the commander said, his voice carrying through the ICU like a question that had been waiting 20 years for an answer. Where is she? The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the attending physicians assembled. The nursing staff materialized from supply rooms and medication stations. The hospital administrator appeared, looking like someone who'd just realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. 3 news cameras had arrived, tipped off by the helicopter landing, local stations hoping for a story about aircraft in the parking lot. They were filming everything. They had no idea what they were actually capturing. The general stepped into the hallway, and the staff parted like water around a stone. His voice was quiet enough that everyone had to lean in to hear it, which meant nobody would miss a word. Dr. Richard Sterling attempted to terminate a decorated combat veteran whose medical expertise exceeds most emergency physicians in this facility. He filed false reports. He fabricated disciplinary actions designed to discredit her medical judgment before she discovered irregularities in his surgical logs. Sterling tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The FBI, the general continued, has been investigating your billing practices for 6 months, Doctor. Phantom procedures. Insurance fraud. Kickbacks from medical supply companies. You needed Senior Chief Morrison gone because she noticed things. She saw patterns. She understood trauma medicine at a level that threatened your entire operation. An FBI agent stepped forward from the SEAL team. He'd been embedded with them the whole time, nobody had even noticed, and read the charges with a kind of precise diction that made courtrooms listen. Healthcare fraud. Insurance fraud. Conspiracy. Medical license suspension effective immediately. Termination from Mercy General and prosecution pending. The cameras captured Sterling's face going from red to white to grey, as if someone was draining the life from him in real time. One of the nurses stepped forward, Jennifer, who'd watched Sterling publicly humiliate Katie in front of the break room. Jennifer slapped him across the face, hard. The sound carried through the ICU like a period at the end of a sentence. You nearly killed my patient because you were afraid of her. Security escorted Sterling out through a gauntlet of staff members, nurses he'd condescended to, physicians he'd undermined, patients' families he'd lied to. His expensive shoes clicked against the tile in rhythm with the sound of his own career ending. Katie watched from the conference room window. She did not smile. She did not move. She took one measured breath and turned back to Marcus Webb, who was sitting up now, holding those combat boots in his hands like they were made of something sacred. You carried these for 20 years, he asked. She nodded. I carried them because I promised your father I would keep you safe. I didn't know if you had survived after I disappeared. Her voice was steady. Every word was true. The operation in Tikrit. You were 7 years old. You were supposed to be somewhere safe. You weren't. Marcus Webb's mother came through the ICU doors, and the moment she saw Katie, she understood. Not all of it. Just enough. She embraced Katie while the SEAL commander stood witness, reading aloud from the file he was holding, Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. Presidential unit citation for an operation that saved 47 lives in Tikrit, including a 7-year-old boy caught in crossfire who'd grown up to be an Army Ranger with a 75th Regiment tattoo on his shoulder. Your service record is restored, the commander said. Your rank is restored. You are no longer in hiding, Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison. You were never forgotten. The Pentagon was always watching. Waiting for you to surface. Katie's hands finally stopped trembling. For the first time in 20 years, she could exhale. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.